Happy New Year. Welcome back. I'm really just like excited. I want to come in all gleeful. I'm excited to start learning with you again, to dive back into this poetry study that we've been doing. Obviously, it's a hell of a day, and it's hard to be gleeful. It's already been a hell of a year, hasn't it? We're 6 days in, and it's already been a hell of a year. And yesterday, it felt like a totally different year. And I just hope that our Torah study does, as it is supposed to do, bring some kind of healing and peace into the world, either metaphysically or just in the sense that it helps us focus and clarify what's most important to us. So let's begin with a blessing. Let's sanctify our learning. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, we're going today to learn. We're going to study some poetry for the new year, and I mean that in a very direct way, because I was thinking I happened to speak this Shabbat, and I was talking about hopefulness, and I borrowed a verse, Kaveh el Hashem chazak v'yametz libecha v'kaveh el Hashem, hope to God, strengthen and encourage your heart, and hope to God. So I talked a little bit about what the rabbis do with that verse, and we'll look at it tonight, but it turns out that verse is the last line in a psalm, and it's the last line in Psalm 27. And it was like, honestly, as I was saying it, I was talking about, looking into a new year and summoning hope and, being in a difficult period. And it was like, as I was talking, I realized, oh, this Psalm 27, that's the psalm for the new year. That's the psalm that we recite in the Jewish calendar, in the Jewish New Year, throughout the month of Elul, the last month of the year. We recite this psalm all throughout that month in preparation for the new year. It has specific references to the new year, or at least by rabbinic interpretation, it does. So we'll see that, and we continue on reciting it until Hoshana Rabbah, which is a good month into the year. So it's a good 2 months. It's on the last month of the year and the first month of the year. We're really deep in this psalm. And it suddenly occurred to me, my goodness. So there's this psalm, one of the psalms that the tradition, I won't say exactly the rabbis, but the composers of our liturgy, intended us to focus on as we headed into a new year. So I thought, oh, that's what we must do. Let's take a look at this psalm and see what it says to us for our Gregorian New Year, for any new year. Because let's not forget, the idea of starting a year is not just given some thought in Jewish tradition, but actually in a certain sense begins Jewish tradition. Our very first national commandment, some of you will recall, if I said pop quiz, what's the first commandment that was given to all the children of Israel? Some of you will be able to like ring the buzzer and say, it's the new month, the new moon, the new year, the beginning of the calendar. So the idea of starting a calendar is actually seen as the kind of the basis for, or the starting place for an entire tradition of conduct, and an entire catalog of laws that are meant to design a whole society. So this is an important topic, and it's this psalm that is meant to speak to that topic. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into it. But I guess I say all that just to tell you how I arrived here, and then the shit hit the fan. This is the best phrase for it. You'll excuse my language, but the shit hit the fan, and then I started thinking, oh my God, what, I can't do a psalm New Year. There's like it's chaos. But of course, you've been with, if you've been with me and read a little bit of the Psalms, you know that chaos and violence and conflict and fear, actually, that's often right at the heart of the matter in the book of Psalms, which is at once the great book of biblical poetry. There are 150 Psalms. It's a little bit like sonnets. The greatest poems recorded in our tradition. And at the same time, the Psalms are not just these 150 pretty songs. They're intense, they're dark, and they deal with some of the themes that actually it is worth us thinking about even on this day of the year. So let's begin. We're going to take a look at Psalm 27, and again, in as much as this psalm is put there by the tradition to have us thinking about Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the beginning of the Jewish New Year. So what will it tell us about this year that we're heading into? Okay, so gonna chat you the source sheet, and then I'm also going to chat you the, as I do here sometimes, I'm gonna chat you the, I retranslate things, and the truth is, I'm just gonna leave it there. When the poetry gets longer, then the lines get all thrown out of place. But this is just 14 lines that we're going to look at tonight. So I think that format should be enough. But I'll screen share as usual. Okay, and as usual, we will take a look at the first line because, as I've said several times now, the biblical poetry often uses that first line as a way of setting a tone. And then, before we even do that, I want to look just actually at the first word, because the first word is sort of a discussion on its own that we haven't had yet. And the discussion is, what is David doing here? What does David have to do with the Psalms? Okay, so let's take a look at the way this one starts. And in fact, this psalm is known as Le David. Right, Le David, which is the first word there, Le David. And that, it's a little hard to translate. It could mean for David, it could mean to David, or it could mean by David, of David, right? And this is not unusual. If you go through the Psalms, you'll find that many of them begin with some mention of David, okay? And hence the traditional notion that David wrote the Psalms, though some of them don't seem to be ascribed to David, and in any way, historically, it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense that David would have written all of the Psalms, but that idea has sort of stayed with us, that the figure of David hovers over the Psalms, and that's the first thing that we're going to consider tonight. So the first line here is Le David Adonai Orivi Ishi Mimi Ira Adonai Ma'oz Chayai Mimi Efchad. For David, and we'll soon look at the content here. The Lord is my light and my salvation. From whom should I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Whom should I dread? But what's up with David, I want to start by asking. And let me give you just a couple of options right off the bat. And I've listed them down at the bottom of the page here. I'm going to give you just the first two mentions of David in the Psalms. And he isn't mentioned in Psalm 1 or Psalm 2, but he is mentioned in Psalm 3 and 4. And they're very different mentions. So let's actually start with Psalm 4, where it says Lamnatzech binginot mizmor leDavid, for the leader, for the organ, for the choir master, with instrumental music, beniginot, mizmor leDavid, a psalm of David's or for David. Okay, that language, mizmor leDavid, actually Tehillim are actually called, or psalms are called mizmorim, so a psalm of David. So this kind of formulation is really where you get the idea, oh, David composed these psalms, or David was right there as they were being composed. So that's one way of looking at David's presence, is that David is the author of the psalms. But just moving backwards, Psalm 3 begins with a different kind of mention of David, and I want to offer it to you as another way of thinking of David's presence in the Psalms, which this is a really kind of only Psalm 3, and it's a very intense mention. Mizmor LeDavid Bivarcho Mipnei Avshalom Bno, a psalm of David when he fled from his son Absalom. Does anyone know that story? David fled from his son Absalom or Avshalom. Why? Because Absalom was trying to kill him. His own son was trying to kill him, right? To ascend to the kingship and to kill his father. Okay, so that kind of reference is a little different. It's like, imagine that this is what David said in that moment. Okay, so there's the tradition that David is actually the author and the poet, but there's also just a notion that we are, the point of the Psalms is to use the figure of David. Well, let me turn that into a question. To use the figure of David as what? Why David? What is it about David, King David, that might be helpful for thinking about an opening line like, the Lord is my light and my salvation, from who shall I fear? Why David? What's David got to do with that sentiment? Okay, let's start with Michal.
Well, two things. One, David is portrayed as a musician. So, you know, there's all sorts of musical annotation with the Psalms. So it naturally goes with that. Another thing is that traditionally, and we see that this all the way up through, you know, the 17th century, the idea of monarchy is often associated with writing poetry, even when the king or queen wasn't the person who wrote it, it was ascribed to them. But also, David is the great lover of God. David is a terrible, terrible guy. He does all sorts of awful things, but he never, his faith in God never wanes. And so for that reason, he's loved.
Good. Okay, those are both important. Let me start with the second one. David is a religious guy. Whatever else you might say about him, and you might say many disparaging things about him, as Michal indicated. The guy is obsessed with God, and that's part of what is distinct about his character. So the Psalms, in as much as they are a dialogue with God, it makes sense to attribute them to this guy who just seemed obsessed with like how God was playing a role in his life and how he might relate to God and how he might serve God. So there's that. And then Michal also says David was from the first described as a musician, played the harp, right, to calm the soul of Saul. And then David becomes the king. David becomes the warrior. David becomes like this kind of great political figure. But it's a kind of an it's an exercise to imagine that the political leader is also a poet. So you have like the things that we might often think about through the lens of politics and state drama. Now we can think about in a lyrical way, in a poetic way, right? So David offers us that opportunity. Okay. Any other thoughts on David specifically before we keep? Yael?
Well, like in the Birkat Hamazon, Lizaro, we are David's progeny. And so when it says Le David, I understand that as we're David's issue. You know, we're all from David. And so the intensity of his life, the intensity of his own child trying to kill him and push him out of the kingship, and then this passion that he has for God, but his also indulgence in his own passions and being willing to kill for them in order to have the woman he wants. We're all in there, and we all have that within us. And so I think this is guiding us to say, don't fear. Even though you have all of this within you, God will still save you.
Okay, good. Thank you, Yael. Right. Yael's description of David is a description of a human being, a person with personal struggles and family drama, and we're looking at a life full of feeling and sadness and chaos and so we are regarding the struggles of an individual and of a human being. And in that sense, Yael says, so we might all have such struggles. We might all have such feelings or conversations with God. But now that we've said that, I think we really gotten to the key of what is so powerful about David as a kind of a muse, if you will, for our poetry, which is that David is both a massive political figure, the king, and so we can project our thoughts and our readings of these words through a kind of a national lens. But David is also an incredibly complicated human being with all kinds of personal dramas. And so David is also the voice of just a human being in the midst of that national struggle. So it works. So as soon as we mention David, we're operating on both the national and the personal level. And that's important, you know, as we turn into this new year. That's one of the things we're doing, right? Is we're doing that throughout the Psalms, but just let's keep that in mind. Okay, I think I saw one more person who wanted to say something specifically about David. No. Okay. So I'm gonna. So let's move now into the opening theme, and the opening theme is fear. Okay. The opening theme is fear. Now, there's a lot to do in these first few verses, but the first thing that I want to do is to tell you why this psalm is thought of as the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur psalm. Either it was picked for this reason, or it was picked and then the rabbis came up with some reasons. But there's a very famous midrash that says that this opening line, "The Lord is my light and my salvation." By the way, I usually translate it as the eternal, but I just felt like for the voice of this particular psalm, Lord is good, actually. The Lord is my light and my salvation. It seemed to work to me better, in part because it is such a personal conversation. The idea that this is speaking to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur comes from Midrash, in Midrash Tehillim. The rabbis interpreted this verse as referring to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. How is it referring to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? My light on Rosh Hashanah and my salvation on Yom Kippur. Okay, that's the idea. Soon we'll see other ways that the rabbis pick up on words and bring them into the opening holiday cycle of the Jewish year. But let's just start with this: Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashanah is light. Yom Kippur is salvation. Now, Rosh Hashanah is the first day of the year, and Yom Kippur is the 10th day of the year. So moving into a new year, the first thing that we speak of is God being a light, and that's Rosh Hashanah, and then God being a salvation, right? So first of all, we're just, as readers of poetry, we've now got like a pair that we have to deal with: the light and the salvation, the light and the salvation. But now the rabbis have given us a kind of an analog to help us think about, light and salvation, like Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashanah is light, Yom Kippur is salvation. What does that mean? How can we make sense? Why is Rosh Hashanah light and then Yom Kippur salvation? Why would that be so? Because that gives us a clue as to what happens in that very first couple of weeks in the year. And so what do you think? Why is Rosh Hashanah light? Stumped. Why is Yom Kippur salvation? Would that be an easier question? Matt Silverstein.
Okay, I'm gonna struggle with the light one, in part because I want to say it's a beginning and I'm opening my eyes, but we start our days at the evening, not with the light. So that kind of
No, but that's
bothers
good,
me.
Matt.
That
No, but that's
bothers
good.
Okay.
The Rosh Hashanah, the light is the beginning of something,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Because we know that Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are linked as holidays, and Rosh Hashanah starts a process that ends with Yom Kippur. In between, we know that because in between, they're not just two random holidays, but in between we speak of the 10 days of tshuva, the Aseret
Right,
Yemei
yeah.
tshuva, the 10 days of repentance, return. So something happens, and may I say, something is illuminated on Rosh Hashanah that then needs a process of 10 days that in the end, Yom Kippur comes to address. So let's build on that. Rachel?
So I don't know that I have a direct answer, but like the way it kind of feels to me, actually going back to your sermon the other day, talking about like the end of Genesis, we've been with family, and then you move into Exodus and it's more of like a nation. And then tonight, Rabbi Brass was talking about self-examination on the individual and then on the community scale. I sort of think about Rosh Hashanah as like the start of thinking about myself. And then on Yom Kippur, when we're all together, we're looking to make teshuvah as ourselves, but also as a community. And we think about the responsibility, not just that we have, but as a community, and that we are responsible for each other. And I think salvation is not something we can find really on our own. I mean, I think we can find like a light in ourselves and but the salvation is in a Jewish community. It's not one Jew, it's in our longevity as Jews. And especially when I think about like the different ideas I think about as God, especially more modern sense, as like God in community and God in all of us, that's where I find the salvation. Like I can find strength here 100%, but my salvation is within the community.
Okay, good. Okay, so that's Rachel's formulation just now is really interesting, because that's a lot of what we were just saying about the figure of David. The figure of David is a personal figure, but also a national figure. And so it is also true that once we begin to talk about the process of the movement between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we're thinking about a personal process. My light, right? This is it's individual language. The Lord is my light, Ori, and my salvation. But we know, in as much as this psalm has been thought to kind of speak to the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur process, that's a collective process, and that at the end, Yom Kippur happens collectively. And I like what Rachel was doing, which is to take sort of both of those binaries and kind of fold them together and to say, maybe I start individual, right? But now that I have the Yom Kippur echo, so then somehow the collective has allowed me to reach that salvation, right? And God is my salvation, right? But the Yom Kippur God is the God that we summon together. Okay, so that's nice. Yonatan.
Kind of in a similar vein, what light does is it creates distinctions. So, and in Jewish mystical language, creation occurs through light, right? So we couldn't exist in a world with no distinctions. There has to be a space where, for Yonatan to exist in this world where the everything doesn't exist. In the nature of that, part of the distinction that's created is the possibility for failure, right? That within this world, we can make wrong choices. And in fact, on the first Rosh Hashanah, we did, right? And we got exiled from Eden, or at least some rabbinic tradition holds that happened on Rosh Hashanah. And so the first act of creation is the act that creates the distinctions. And then Yom Kippur is an act in which those distinctions that are wrong, I don't know if wrong is quite the right word, but the mistakes, we have a chance to overcome them.
Okay, that's really interesting. That's really, really interesting. I want to pick up on especially one thing that you said, which is that the light is the first. Light in Jewish tradition has to echo creation. That's the first thing, right? So and so Rosh Hashanah is the first of the year and is like the beginning of time all over again, and that starts with light, with you said distinction, because light illuminates and clarifies things. Now, I want to then build on that and say that now we can start to see the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur movement as presenting a kind of a template for the beginning of the year, in which at the very beginning, day one, New Year's Day, things are illuminated, clarified. Right? That's Rosh Hashanah, is to take an accounting, a stock of ourselves and our world, because now remember, we're operating on both the personal and the national level. So we're going to illuminate, we're going to shine a light on things. We're going to figure out what is needed. And then we have 10 days to work on those things. Right? And if we work on them correctly, then by the end of the 10 days, right, January 10th, or let's say January 20th, right? At the end of those 10 days, then we can be saved. But we can't unless we figure out what we need to, unless things have been illuminated, okay? So we've done a lot of work just on these opening lines, but it's important work, because now we have a sense of why this psalm has been borrowed for the new year or turned into a kind of template for the new year. So here we are, we're shining a light on things. And what do we see when we first turn on that light? The first thing that we see, the first thing we start talking about is fear. Now, the psalmist, David, whoever, seems not to be afraid at first, but just you wait, okay? So let's take a look now at the first few lines. So, the Lord is my light. LeDavid, Adonai orivi ishi mimi ra, Adonai me'oz chayai mimi avchad. The Lord is my light and salvation. From who should I fear? I don't fear anyone. The Lord is the stronghold of my life. That's a little bit of an awkward word, but a good translation for ma'oz, the strong thing, chayai, in my life. So from whom should I dread? Now, in terms of poetry and just sort of playing with language, it is worth us, and I open the floor, though I'm not going to ask a direct question about this, it's worth us thinking about what's the difference in all of the parallelisms that were given in Psalms. What's the difference between the first part and the second part here, right? If God is the light and the salvation, how's that different from the stronghold of my life? And how is fear different from dread? Okay, so this is like things to think about. I'll give you just one example. Here's the Malbim, great 19th century interpreter. And he says, and I'm not sure he's right, but this is just an example of how he might play with these words and how you might also. Yirah, fear, is from a known thing, that's fear, and pachad, dread, is from something unknown. Now, I'm not sure that's true, but that's just an interesting way of trying to split the difference here. Like, what does it mean, from who should I fear, from whom should I dread? Like, is it just poetry, or are there different kinds of fear that David or the psalmist is playing with? But the point should be that it doesn't matter because we're not afraid, right? We don't fear. God is with us. We don't fear. But then line 2 comes in, and it is just savage. When evildoers come close to me to devour my flesh, it is they, my torturers and my enemies, who stumble and fall. Bekrov alai mereim lechol et basari, tsarai va'oivai li, hema chashlu v'nafalu. Should a camp encamp upon me, my heart would have no fear. Should war arise upon me, in this I trust. Im tachanai alai machane, lo yira libi, im takum alai milchama, B'zot ani voteach. Okay, so let's just for a second, like, wonder about what's going on here, because I didn't fear anything, did I? And then all of a sudden, evildoers were coming to devour my flesh, right? Whoa, devour, like, and I looked at all the commentaries and I don't really have a strong sense. I mean, let's again think about David and David's life and David's, but like, to devour my flesh, my torturers and my enemies stumble and fall. Okay. Should a camp encamp upon me, my heart would have no fear. Should a war arise upon me, in this I trust. And maybe I'll open it up with a question of this. Wait, what do I trust? Because it doesn't say what exactly it is that I trust. So what am I trusting? Like, I don't fear anything, but should people come to literally eat my flesh, maybe not literally, poetically eat my flesh, then I trust in what? That they will fall? Like, what's going to happen? What am I trusting in? How are you reading this so far? Is God's going to help? What's happening here? Matt?
Yeah, I read it as God. That's what I'm reading it as. That directly as it goes back to the beginning, and that I'm trusting that God will do whatever it is, my light or my salvation or my whatever.
No matter what, they're all coming for me. An entire camp, an entire army is assailing upon me, but I trust in God, that God will be my light, that God will be my salvation, that they will fall, and God has got it. God's in charge. Other Matt Webster, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say that this reminds me of combat, which the only kind of combat that I have experience with is hand-to-hand combat. I have about 3 years of intensive hand-to-hand combat experience. And gosh, this psalm expresses, as well as anything I've read, the kind of belief and faith that it requires to commit yourself to winning in combat.
Wow, thank you for that. Thank you for that perspective. It is, I mean, that's a perspective I don't have, and I appreciate. And also, is to hear you say that makes me feel even more moved by the language of this poem, because you're exactly right that the language here is war language. We saw actual war. Let's see. Should war arise upon me, right? Im takum alai milchama. It's a funny phrase. A war like rises up against me. And the other very explicit sort of military language is bikrovalai mereim. When they come close to me, that's hand-to-hand combat, right? When they approach me and they are attacking me, they are attacking my flesh, right? In modern Hebrew, krav is like is battle, is hand-to-hand combat, right? So, and again, we are thinking about the national and the personal. So here is a person saying, should a war arise and I am threatened by a war, I the king, I the nation, right? But also should I personally be persecuted? Should I be my tortures in my life? And both of those things are happening, right? Should those things happen, God will take care of me. God takes care of me on the personal level. God takes care of me on the national level. And as Matt says it, on the sort of not just national king, but national soldier. Like, what is it like to be at war? And what would it be like to believe that God was, forget about on my side, God was going to save me? Michal.
I just want to say that I think that your translation of the stronghold of my life is a good one here, because it's setting up all that warlike language and imagery, because a stronghold is a place of defense in war. So for me, I agree with Matt number one, right? That it seems very clear that what it's referring to is the beginning of the poem, because it's already set up what's going to be the conceit that's then played out, which is this military or militarized language.
That's really great. So in this I trust is God, but God, after all, is the stronghold. So I trust in the stronghold, in the fortress, in Jerusalem, in the walls. I trust in all of the structures that will keep me safe. And God is sort of at the heart of that, but also there's something very literal about it, about the stronghold language as well.
Unless you want to take the whole thing as a metaphor.
Well, I'm taking it as both, or at least I'm like, I'm allowing for both, which is I sort of thought where you were going, but maybe I went further than you.
I mean, I just didn't want to say that it's only literal.
Right, for sure not that, because it is God. God is the stronghold. Florine.
Well, if you look at it literally, yeah, you're looking to the concept of a warrior god. But if you're looking at it from another level, God is going to save our soul. He's always going to protect our soul. So it's not looking at it literally. But I don't know if David was capable of that.
Okay, great. I don't know if David was, but that's a good question. But I know that the rabbis were, right? And this language so far, and Matt is exactly right. This is military language. This is the language of the national conflict. What is going to happen on the steps of the Capitol? What is going to happen in this country, right? But the rabbis imagined that the war was a war with what's inside of me, was a war with my own struggles, with my own relationships, with my own failings, with my own sins. So as soon as they projected it through the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur language, all of that like fortress, stronghold, battle, devouring my flesh becomes also spiritual, personal language, right? Okay. I see Dina waving. Dina, hi. Unmute yourself, would you?
Okay. This is actually the first time I've thought of this verse in terms of the individual at war with their surroundings. We have so many cases of spouse abuse, parent abuse, whatever. You have people who live for years under constant attack, and yet some of them come out totally crippled and totally unable to function in society, and repeats of the parents of the behavior, whatever. But so many others come out completely different, absolutely sane, believing in the good in people, and balanced and sane. And it just occurred to me that these kinds of beliefs and following this kind of creed is what can keep people sane, giving the faith that, yeah, somebody there someday, somewhere is going to come and help me. And in too many situations, we don't see that.
That's a deep insight you've given us, Dina. That is, and in some ways, it's just a straightforward read of the verses, because if we read them carefully, we realize that this person who is saying, God is my salvation, I trust in God, all is, this person is also dealing with all kinds of trauma. And so their statements that I trust this are also statements that of attempting to trust it, of articulating, I do not fear, even as the world is terrifying around this person. So it is summoning that trust and that faith as much as it is as it appears at the beginning to be a kind of a plain statement of, if you just read the first line, it feels like so confident. God's my who could I possibly fear from? Well, I can fear from my torturers who are trying to devour my flesh. That's who, right? So, but I have to trust. Okay, so that's the opening. A lot of fear in the world, but the attempt to summon trust, and we've got a Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur overlay where we're imagining that, we have to understand, we have to survey the landscape before we can get to the place where we see God as the salvation, where we really do trust that, right? Okay, then there's as often happens in the Psalms, there's a kind of a, record scratch pivot into a totally different idea. right? So far, working through this fear, and I trust this completely. And then all of a sudden, and this is one of the famous lines from the Psalm, all of a sudden there is a request. Maybe you know this line. Achat she'alti met Hashem ota vakesh shivti beveis Hashem kol yemei chayai lachzos benoam Hashem ulevaker beheichalo Lachzos benoam Hashem ulevaker beheichalo. It's been turned into that beautiful melody because it's a beautiful line. But like, remember that we were just dealing with all of this terror. So then how do we move into this very beautiful, but sort of this random new thought, which is that there is one thing that I have asked of the Lord, and this is what I will seek: to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord, to visit God's abode. So nice. Like that's, wait a minute, why is that all of a sudden the thing that is coming up for you? You've been talking about how you have to trust God, or you gotta believe that God is your salvation, or else these people are gonna come and devour your flesh. But I have one request, and I've always thought it's a little bit, just one little thing, which is, I just wanna live in the house of the Lord every day of my life. It's not a little thing at all, right? Like, I just, one tiny little request, which is that I want to see God and live beside God always forever. It's like, okay, that's the only thing you want, right? Let's add to that the next couple of lines here, just so we move through the poem. Ki yitzpaneni besuko b'yom ra'ah yastireni beseter ohalo b'tsur yiromameni. For God will shelter me in God's sukkah. And here's more reason for the rabbis to pick up and say, oh, there was Rosh Hashanah, there was Yom Kippur, now there's Sukkot. So God will shelter me in God's canopy, God's sukkah, on an evil day, will hide me under the cover of God's tent, will raise me upon a rock. Now my head is raised high over my enemies who are all around me. I will offer up trua blasts in God's tent. Trua, again, holiday language there, the sounding of the shofar. I will sing and chant to the eternal. Okay, so we've had like a movement here, right? We were terrified, but we were tempting to have faith, to believe, to trust in God, even as the war was coming down upon us. And then all of a sudden we turn and we say, I just want to be with God all the days of my life. It's so beautiful. But maybe the next couple of lines help us understand what that means, because then God will shelter me in God's sukkah. God will raise me up on a rock, cover me with God's tent. And now my head is raised high and I offer, I basically I'm tooting a trumpet. I sing and I chant to the eternal. Okay, so what's happened here? And how do we understand it as just, I don't know, narrative? It's like a funny, like, as I said, a record scratch. I fear, but I must trust. And then all of a sudden, I have a request, which is to be with God always, and it'll be so great. And so what was that movement? What just happened there? Let's see. Just want to see anyone who hasn't spoken yet that wants to jump in? Hannah Jensen.
Yeah, so I just had this very weird thought about, I'm wondering if the thing that, the fact that he talks about, in this I trust, and it's not totally clear what this is, but it's in the feminine, zot, and then you have achat sha'alti, you have another thing in the feminine that's a little bit vague and weird. And I wonder if this is that's the thing that whoever's writing this trusts, that's what David trusts, is this request. That the trust that he feels is in the validity of the request that he's made and the understanding that God will provide for that. And so it seems like a strange twist that it's like, okay, you're in all this fear, and then I wouldn't have any fear because I trust this thing. What do you trust? What he trusts maybe is that this is going to play out for him, and that he has to have his faith rooted in that in order to be able to in any way weather the storms that are coming, is to say like, nope, I've already made this request of God. I know this is going to happen. I know I'll still have this relationship with God. I'll see the beauty of the Lord. I'll be in the house of the Lord. And so I have to let go of that fear.
Great. Okay, great. You see what Hannah's done here? I want to just make sure we caught this, because Hannah has given us, like, has taken away the record scratch, right? Because it seemed like Bezot ani boteach, in this I trust, referred back to everything beforehand. God is the light. God is going to save me. They will stumble. In that I trust. But as Hannah's reading it, it's more like a colon. If all this happens, what do I trust? I trust the following, which is that I've been asking for God to be near God, and I trust that God will answer my request. And I will all of these things. I will be sheltered in God's sukkah. I will be raised up. My head, I trust in all these things. And I guess I'm wondering, Hannah, am I trusting that God will answer? I guess I'm wondering, is it important that I've asked for it? Like, do I trust that this is just what God does? Or do I trust that when I call out to God, I will be answered? Which of those, Hannah, are you reading?
What a great question. I don't know if I have so much clarity on it. I think the latter, though. I think that it's that the active request is part of it. It's not just this static existence thing where there's this belief based on nothing. It's that I took initiative, I have some kind of agency, and as such, for asking for what I need and want, I trust that will be fulfilled in some way.
Okay, good. Okay, so we're not clear, but I do find that to be a particularly interesting reading, which is that it's not just that I trust that God will shelter me and God will raise me up and my head is raised high and I'm going to sing and chant, but I trust it because what I trust is that I've been asking for this, and I will continue to, right? This is in the past, achat sha'alti, and this is in the future, and I will keep asking. And I want to be near God. And I want to gaze on God's noam, God's pleasantness, God's beauty. In part, it is because I so desire to be close to God. It's because I express that. It's because I call out to God. It's not just that I trust that God is good or salvation, but God, I trust that God will respond to this request that I make, in part because I love God, but in part because I'm terrified, right? And my role in it is significant. Couldn't be that God wouldn't listen to the thing that I've been asking every single day and that I keep asking, right? And if he has to keep asking, one wonders, is it really so assured? Okay. All right. Let's hear from Rachel and then Michal.
It's interesting because it's such an interesting thing to read today in a pandemic. It's like, who do I fear? Everybody. What do I dread? Everything. And sometimes when I look at these as poetry, I get very lost. But as soon as I start thinking about them as monologue, they start to make a lot more sense to me. So when I envision this in my head, I get this image, not of this person that everyone is saying, someone that is afraid and is trying to psych themselves up for the football game and is I don't fear anything and I don't have experience in combat, but I do sort of do this before I go on stage of I have this, and when I'm no, I'm gonna actually throw up on this set. And so it to me, it's oh, this is someone who is afraid, but this is what you have to tell yourself. And then you have that beautiful thing in the middle, which I think is where the vulnerability comes in. And then asking to dwell in the sukkah, it's not asking to dwell in a constant state of security, because the sukkah acknowledges that there is no security, but it's still this beautiful thing that we take solace in. So I think it's actually the fighting back of the fear just by saying it, and it doesn't negate, it's not lying to yourself. It's hoping for the courage to do something.
Good.
And I agree with Hannah that it's not saying, oh, God's going to answer me. The strength is in the asking, which is Rabbi Lou saying, I'm not praying because I expect, God to change something. I'm praying because I expect God to change me.
Good. Okay. Very nice account of the sort of the ambivalent, the insecure state of this person who is going out to war, getting up on stage, just afraid for any number of reasons, but summoning the belief that they don't fully yet believe, but are trying to believe. I will be okay. It will be okay, right? And as I look out towards a new year, I think about all of the things that I am dealing with, and I look out at my nation and I see the forces of evil and of war and of conflict rising, but it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. I believe in God. I believe in God. I believe in God. And I hope that God is going to protect me, right? Right? Okay.
Just one thing, and then you go forward, and that is the courageous thing. Like the stepping out there, even if you don't think you have that courage and you're praying for it, you still end up doing the most courageous thing in the end.
Let me, I'm going to turn to Michal soon, but I just, in part because I want to make sure we see the whole poem before we finish, but also because I think it flows nicely from what Rachel was just giving us. There's a back and forth here that we're now noticing. There's a kind of like confidence, fear, right? Trust in God, deep insecurity, right? Closeness to God, anxiety about whether or not I'll be protected by God. And look at how, right, God's gonna raise me up on this rock, and I'm trumpeting my horn. It's like, everything's great again. And then verse 7, there's another pivot. Because suddenly then, Shema Adonai Koli Ekra v'chaneni v'aneni, right? Listen, God, to my voice when I call, Shema Adonai Koli Ekra v'chaneni v'aneni, and show me grace and answer me. Now, you can just hear that there's a turn, because this is not speaking to God, this is speaking about God. And then suddenly, the psalmist turns straight to God and says, listen to me, hear my voice. So it's not so assured that you were going to listen to me. And this is one of the most sort of beautiful and complex lines in here. To you, my heart said, seek my face. O Lord, I seek your face. Lecha amar libi, bakshu fanai. Et panecha Adonai avakesh. So I'm not even sure exactly how to read that, but my heart said to you, hey, look at my face. You look at me, right? But I have looked at you. I have sought your face. It's a kind of like, I'm here. I'm doing this. I'm in. But I'm also, my heart, not just me anymore, but my scared little heart is calling out to you. Right, and saying, hey, like, look, seek us, seek my face, in language that's usually only reserved for God, right? We seek your face, but we want you to seek our face, or my heart's face. Do not hide your face from me. Al taster panechem mimeni. Oh, well, why was God going to hide God's face? I thought God was always there and saving and everything was good, but now we're worried that God's going to hide God's face. Do not thrust aside your servant in anger. You have ever been my help. You have been a help to me. Do not forsake me. Do not abandon me, O God of my salvation. So, like, don't abandon me, God of my salvation. So Rachel's exactly right. There's this kind of like, yeah, you're absolutely going to take care of me. I trust in you 100%. Aren't you? Right? Don't abandon me after all. You're not going to abandon me, right? Because you would never do such a thing. It's like back and forth, very unstable voice here that stands at the beginning of the year. Michal?
You know, it's interesting that you use the word unstable, because that to me is, you're really looking at the psychology of the poem. But what I really love about this is the way the structure of it is, it's an associative way of building this poem. And it seems so, to me, it seems so natural. So you start with this idea of the light and the salvation, the stronghold, and that leads you naturally to start thinking about sort of a structure, right? And then you get the tents. If the tent, if a machaneh should be, the army should be camped above me, which leads directly to the idea of the home, and the back to the idea of a stronghold, the rock, the sukkah, right? So it's all building in sort of a natural association of images that just keeps going until you get to the very end, where you've moved from these structures through the verbs of the poem to the idea of listening and seeing, and then finally the face, and then you're back at the light.
Okay, all right. So that was it's 6:58. So I really appreciate that. You guys sort of took us home. So let's do that. Let's make sure that we actually read the rest of the poem. And just to echo what Michal's just said, like the imagery we've seen is a lot of structural imagery, a lot of protective imagery. The stronghold, the tent, the fortress, the mountain, the all around me. And also the imagery of the enemies that are coming around me, but I have what is the primary role that God plays here is to block them out, to protect me, to guard me, to keep me safe, even as these forces are coming in on me. But it's very tangible, physical fear for my life, my Dalet Amos, my space. Okay, let's just take a look at the rest of the poem, and then we'll open it up for a final discussion. But let's just see now. Okay, there's yet another shocking line here, right? Like, hear my voice, that insecurity has come back. I want to seek your face. Will you seek my face? Don't thrust me aside. Don't abandon me. Don't forsake me, O God of my salvation. Now, I don't want God to abandon me, but then now listen to this line. This is one of the darkest lines in all of the Psalms. Though my father and mother abandon me, the Lord will gather me in. Ki avi ve'imi azavuni v'Hashem yasfeni. Though my father and mother abandon me, God will gather me in. Why would my father and mother abandon me? Where does that come from? We don't have time for it, but I have a Rashi down at the bottom that it has a very very wild and fun answer to that. But we'll leave it aside for now. What is going on here where on the one hand, I'm worried that God will abandon me, but on the other hand, I'm saying everyone else has abandoned me. My mother and father are going to abandon me, but not you, O Lord. You will gather me in. So show me your way, O Lord, and guide me down a steady path because of my watchful foes. Do not give, that should say my life, over to my torturers, for false witnesses and violent accusers have risen up against me. Okay? And then, okay, so that's like, I don't know exactly what to do with this line here, but I'm fascinated by it. My father and mother abandoned me. But let's just make sure we read these last two lines, because they are really also, particularly in this very short poem, there are many famous lines, and the last two are famous as well. Now, speaking of like rhetorical devices here, notice the ellipses. I did not put that in. That ellipses is in Safaria's translation. And it's because this next line is so strange, it trails off. Lule hemanti lirot betuv Adonai be'eretz chayim. Had I not had faith that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. What? Had I not had faith in what? But that's the line. Had I not had faith that I would see the Lord in the land of the living. Hope in the Lord. Strengthen and encourage your heart and hope in the Lord. So there's something missing here. It's like you can hear the psalmist almost sort of like ruminating, like, yeah, if I hadn't believed in God, boy, I tell you, I would have been, like that's all you get. What would you have, like? But I do believe in God, right? And then the last line here, which I'll read, and then I'll just ask us to chew on for the last couple of minutes here. The last line I think is also quite significant, because this is the line that I spoke about on Shabbat. Hope in the Lord, kavel Hashem, how great. But then it says, chazak v'yametz libecha, strengthen and encourage your heart. Remember, again, the heart has the heart was speaking before, and hope in the Lord. And okay, so there's poetry, right? Hope, strength, hope. But on Shabbat, I quoted this piece in the Talmud that explains that. Rabbi Chamas Bar Chanina says, a person who prays and sees that they were not answered should pray again. As it says, hope in the Lord, strengthen and encourage your heart, and hope in the Lord. that's a remarkable reading, because he's understanding the echo to be, I hoped in the Lord, but it didn't work. My prayers were not answered. So I strengthened myself and I hoped in the Lord again. Okay, so there you have like a couple of mysterious, sort of one line that trails off and one line that seems to like start, stop, and start again, right? So, and I think a lot of this back and forth echoes some of the interpretations that we've heard so far, of just being there, believing, being in it. Yes, God's going to take care of me. I'm going to be okay. And at the same time, whoa, is this working? Will God take care of me, or will God abandon me? What, you know, what, I don't even have my mother and father. Will you be there or not? Okay, so that's, now you've seen the poem. Let's take a few thoughts before we close tonight. Emil.
Yeah, I guess just echoing what you said, that like even in spite of all the reassurance, I'm not sure if that's the overall impression I'm left with. Like by the end of the poem, you know, like just invoking like dread, fear, anxiety, all these things tends to overwhelm the hope, you know, or it's like the hope seems very fragile. And like, assuming he's like an adult when he writes this, like it's only when you're really shaken that you start calling out for your parents again. You know, like it's like if you're thinking of it like the warrior king and it's like, my parents abandoned me, but I'm leading an army, you know, it's, so I think that like, I mean, I think it is really powerful. I think it is resonant, but you know, ultimately it's like just those words are so heavy that, you know, the hope at the end seems like heartfelt, but maybe not rousing, you know. It's like, I mean, it's really a prayer that like let's like, hopefully this will kick in soon, because like I'm just surrounded by enemies who want to eat my flesh. But you know, let's give this a whirl.
Yeah, beautifully narrated, beautifully put. Yonatan and then Dina.
There's some language I want to latch on to having to do with seeing God's face, which is not pulled from a vacuum. That's language that's used a lot in Torah, including around the holidays, right? We do the holidays in Jerusalem to see God's face, but specifically when the psalmist says, don't hide your face from me, there is one person that God hid God's face from, which is Moses, in the rock, right? And I think that this line, the line with the ellipses, if I didn't have faith in all the goodness, I think that's what it relates to. That saying basically, you know, if I really had the knowledge, if I had the kind of intimate knowledge that I want and that I know that I cannot have with God, to see the entire plan, right? To see all of God's goodness and really understand it, how could any of the rest of the stuff here matter, right? Like,
it's so
what do I care about this battle? What do I care about, you know, my successes?
Right. Okay, that's so well put, Yonan. That is, we've been all sort of processing the ambivalence or insecurity in these statements of faith. But as Yonatan puts it in quite starkly, which is, if you really believed these things, if you really had faith, it really isn't a problem. Like, if that first line was to be taken seriously, from who should I fear? How could I possibly fear? But of course, it's not that simple. Of course, it's not that simple, and I do fear. And I want to just show you this, and then I'll turn to Dina. Since Yonatan highlights the line, had I not had faith that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living, right? There are scribal traditions that put dots over certain words. We've studied this before in my Parsha class, and there happens to be dots over the first word there. Had I not, if not for, lule, right? So I found this incredible Rashi here, where he says, and he's quoting from the Talmud, had I not believed, right? If I had not believed the Holy Blessed One, those false witnesses would have already risen against me and destroyed me. Okay, that's fine. But the word lule is punctuated, right? Those little dots, which our sages interpreted as follows. I know that you give reward to the righteous in the world to come, but I don't know whether I have a share with them or not. It's just one formulation of like how God might work. But what I especially like is that idea that like, yeah, I believe in certain things. I might believe that there is a God. I might even believe God protects, but are you going to protect me? Am I I don't actually know whether you got my back in there. Sure, I believe everything's going to turn out God's fine. But like, what about me? Ellipses, 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 right? And the rabbis indicated that ellipses with little dots over the. Okay, Dina, I'll give you the last words.
It's the same exact sentence that we've been talking about. Those ellipses open up everything. Anyone can read that one paragraph and say, well, if I hadn't done this, or if I didn't have faith in this, and it can be applied to any life situation in the world. It can be applied to everyone for anything. And it's really profound to me, because it can apply. It's there, it's real, and whatever you need that to say after those ellipses, God will let you say it.
Yeah, and remember that the things that we are applying it to from the start, when we thought about David and David's life and David as a reference point, and also, frankly, when we think about ourselves heading into this year in our own lives, but also in this complicated and messy country that we're in this complicated and messy world that we're in, this, as Dina says, this process is a kind of a universal movement that could apply to all kinds, personal and national struggles, where I believe that everything's going to be okay, but actually I'm terrified. But actually, in spite of that, I believe, and I believe that God will save me. But actually, I'm not sure that God will save me. But in spite of my uncertainty, I insist on believing, and back and forth and back and forth. And I hope in God, but then I have to strengthen myself so that I can hope in God again. And then I lose that hope, and I hope in God again. And actually, it turns out that the opening line of who should I possibly fear from is really just a front for all of the tremendous fears that I have. I have so many fears. I fear that I'm going to be annihilated completely. I fear that not even my mother and father will be there for me. But I hope anyway. I hope anyway. I hope anyway. And you can hear the psalmist actually doing it to themselves. Hope in God, like actually like saying it. As Emil said, this really is a prayer. This person is really praying. So let's also really pray. Let's really summon hope. Let's really try to believe, even though we don't believe. Let's try to be unafraid, even though we are afraid. Let's try to have hope, even though we feel hopeless as we head into this new year. Let's illuminate, let's clarify what we need to work on, and pray that we'll get to the place where we can really say with full throats, God is my salvation. So we'll leave it there tonight. Thank you so much. Good to be back.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So glad you're back.
See you next week.